Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Well, where to begin? So much has changed. Yeah, I mean, it's really striking. It's striking not just how much has changed between Trump and his predecessors, but how much has changed between Trump 1 and Trump 2. So, you know, some of the key changes that we've seen since Trump became president again, and I think the most striking and most important change has been a willingness to basically question the kind of core principles of the post-war international legal order. So Trump 1, you didn't see this so much. I mean, maybe it was a little bit behind the scenes or underneath the surface, but you never really saw it kind of break out in the open. This idea that there was a willingness to question the kind of basic idea that states should agree not to go to war with each other. So the United Nations Charter, which was adopted after World War II, provides that states revoke the right to unilaterally use force against one another. And the only exception to that is self-defense or if authorized by the UN Security Council. And we have seen, so the United States really was the champion of this idea, really fought for this idea in the war. This was obviously contrary to the values and aspirations of Hitler and the Axis, which is all about conquest and using war to aggrandize their states and add territory. And so the central kind of principle for which we fought in World War II was this basic idea of a prohibition on war and renunciation of the right of conquest and renunciation of a right to go to war unilaterally. And what we're seeing in the second Trump administration is what seems to be a willingness to kind of throw that all away. Now, I say seems to because there's a lot of talk and there hasn't been as much action, although I will say no action consistent with this. So you hear him talking about things like making Canada the 51st state, or taking back the Panama Canal, or taking Greenland. You know, these are really clear threats to upend the global legal order and the kinds of threats we really didn't hear in Trump 1. Now one might say, well, it's a lot of bluster, you know, this is Trump kind of being Trump and saying kind of crazy things. But the people who are on the receiving end of this don't think it's just bluster. You know, I mean, Europe, I think, is deeply concerned. Canada is deeply concerned. You see states willing to invest more in their own defense. They're thinking about how to reorient themselves in a world in which the United States not only is not maintaining the global order, but might be ready to upend it and attack it. And then you also see things like Trump strikes on Iran, which was clearly illegal, right? So those are actually actions that are unlawful actions, using military force unilaterally without seeking any kind of consent from the Security Council or really making an attempt to make a good case that it's consistent with international law. So that's the kind of number one big shift that we're seeing. I mean, there's lots else going on, but you know, that's the thing that I think is most important and that really worries me the most. And this is a fair point. You know, Iraq in particular was a major affront to the idea that states shouldn't be able to just use force to enforce their will. And, you know, it is important to note that at least there was an attempt to add a legal claim there. So the claim was that there were weapons of mass destruction, that it was necessary for U.S. self-defense, that, you know, if the United States didn't act, that the result was going to be a nuclear disaster. Of course, those claims turned out not to be true, but had they in fact been true, then there may have been some justification. Although I think even then, you know, the failure to get Security Council authorization, and we could go into the details of the many legal failures, but the rest of the world, I think, views that as an illegal intervention, and I think rightly so. And so, one might say, well, so, is what Trump's doing really all that different? And I think it is different. It's different in a couple respects. It's different first in, as I mentioned, the Bush administration at least tried to kind of come up with a good argument. You might say like, oh, that's a really kind of thin, fig leaf. But, the lawyers worked hard to try and come up with justification consistent with the principles of international law. You had, John Bellinger and the rest of the lawyers sort of trying to come up with a good argument, and they convinced the United Kingdom that they had a good enough argument. They went to the Security Council and they provided the evidence that they had. Again, turned out to be false. But Colin Powell, I don't think necessarily knew, I don't think he knew that the evidence he was presenting was false. So and there were a number of allies who were, participating in that effort and who were persuaded that this was justified, even though, again, in the end, I think it wasn't. Here, what we're seeing is like none of that effort, and a kind of cavalier attitude towards the international order that seems to suggest a kind of willingness to kind of throw it all away. Now, that said, I do think that, there is a responsibility that predecessors have and that lawyers who've worked for predecessors have for, in a way, kind of setting the table for what's happening now. I do think Iraq was, a tragedy, and I think undermined much of the world's trust in the idea that these were principles that were universal. And then I think Obama, again, counterterrorism operations and expansion of self-defense justification to include wide range of quote unquote counterterrorism plans, but wasn't ever clear that, for instance, ISIS actually posed a real threat to the United States that justified, the bombing in Iraq and Syria that the Obama administration engaged in starting in 2014. So I think the point is fair. But it's one thing to be kind of breaking the rules here and there, and another thing to sort of be willing to kind of invade your neighbor, or at least suggest that you will do that, to take Greenland, to seize territory. It's just a different order of magnitude kind of affront to the international order, and I think threatens to just kind of throw the whole thing out the window. Whereas I think the previous actions were sort of cracks in the veneer that were undermining it slowly. Look, I think the fact that the United States, while, taking actions that were not always perfectly consistent with the UN Charter, nonetheless was largely defending these basic rules, for instance, doing overflight in the South China Sea to try and enforce the legal claims of China's neighbors to the islands and reefs in the South China Sea, the supporting of Ukraine and its resistance against Russia's attempt to conquer its territory, the support for NATO and for all the defensive preparations to enable the Baltic states to defend themselves if Russia were to try and invade. The kind of clear messaging the United States was not going to stand for a state invading its neighbor, including when the U.S. came to Kuwait's defense, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and tried to take over that territory. What Trump is signaling here is not only is the U.S. going to stop playing that role of trying to enforce those rules, but the U.S. is actually thinking about maybe kind of joining in the fray itself, and taking territory itself and using force, including things like, using force against drug cartels in Mexico and Venezuela as well, like actually extending policing operations into Latin America. And that then, if the U.S. starts doing that, it legitimizes everybody else doing the same thing, right? So then we can't really complain if China decides that, it wants a little bit of the Philippines, or, that a few of those islands would be handy to have, or if Russia wants to invade a few more of its neighbors, or if other states, decide that they're frustrated with their neighbor and want to invade and take territory, or territory looks, tantalizing and there's resources that they'd like, if the rules no longer apply, the whole system can break down. I mean, the thing to remember is that we have been living in a very different kind of world since World War II than existed for hundreds of years before that. For hundreds of years, it was legal and legitimate for states to invade one another and take one another's territory and stuff. You know, conquest and booty and prize were all part of the ordinary law of the game in the international legal order. And this was a kind of radical thing that the world did in renouncing war, first in 1928 and then reaffirming it in the UN Charter. And so we have lived with this peace. I mean, all of us in our memory have lived with this peace, and we kind of take it for granted, but it doesn't have to be that way. And once you take away this idea that states shouldn't be invading one another, shouldn't be simply, taking their grievances and using military force to settle those grievances, you're going to see a much, much more violent world. And that's what I'm scared of. That's what I'm worried about. That's what I think is at stake here. Yeah. I mean, look, Root is a product of his time. And I think it's really important to remember that time was not a lawless time. There was international law. It's just that international law was just completely different than it is today. Right? So the international law at the time was, if another state wrongs you, you can go to war against them. You know, they fail to pay a debt. You go and take their stuff in repayment. They interfere with your trade relations. You go and destroy their ships. That was totally fine. That was the law of the day. And so he was a advocate for and a spokesperson for the law that existed at the time. And, you know, the world decided that was leading to two, extraordinary wars that led to tens of millions of deaths. And maybe that was not a great way to live in a world in which the technology of war allowed for this extraordinary level of extermination of human beings in the pursuit of those aims by states. And so Root, was speaking for a certain kind of time. The thing is that if we go back to that rules that he was speaking for, we now have all that technology that allows a much more, a much more deadly kind of use of force. And, we're not prepared, I think, for what could come. The question, though, that you asked, that you started with, is kind of like what comes next. And I do think, there's part of me that is mourning, what we're seeing happening to the international legal order, and wants to do everything that I can to try and support retaining and maintaining that as best we can. But I think, the question you asked at the outset, Nathan, was, I think, a fair one, which is like, look, this has already been under pressure for a while. We've been seeing kind of assaults on this idea that states can't use force to achieve their ends for a while. And that's true, and there are lots of things that are not perfect about the modern international legal order. To name one, the states that won World War II created an international system that basically kind of cast their control over the United Nations in amber. And so the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, are the states that, quote unquote, won the war. So US, Russia, France, China, and the UK. It doesn't make a whole lot. Like those 5 states, if you were making a kind of who's going to be in charge today, that is not the 5 states you would choose. Like that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Africa is completely excluded. Latin America is completely excluded. South America is completely excluded. So, you would design it very differently today. And a lot of states, I think, have some skepticism and understandable skepticism towards the international order, both because they don't have that kind of role that the United States has of kind of unusual control over the levers of international power. And because they see that there's been a lot of hypocrisy in the way in which the rules have been applied, that certain states get held to standards that others don't. So, as I start thinking about like, what do we do? What can be recovered here? I do think that, in addition to trying to hold on to what we can of this prohibition on use of force, because I think a descent into chaos and violence does no one any good. But I do think a kind of recognition that the system has been under pressure for a long time. It's time to start rethinking it, and that we need to, for instance, create more ways for middle powers to play a significant role in governing the international order, that more states need to play a role in their defense. I don't think it's wrong to think that states in Europe probably need to rely less on the United States for their defense, for instance. So I think there are things that we can learn. It's not just trying to kind of staunch the bleeding of the system, but also trying to think about like, what can we do to make things better? There are a number of mistakes that advocates of international trade made. And I think perhaps the biggest, I don't think was advocacy of the international trade system. I actually think on the whole, the economics are just kind of inarguable that trade makes sense as a way of generating global wealth, both for individual states and for the globe as a whole. But the benefits are broad-based. The benefits are broad-based, and the costs are very concentrated. So you have lower consumer. Consumer goods cost a lot less as a result of global free trade. But a lot of people lose their jobs. And the people who lose their jobs are concentrated in communities where they don't really have good alternatives, so you have the closing, early on of, U.S. manufacturing plants of various kinds. Of course, U.S. steel, if it's essentially disappeared, textiles, apparel, all these kinds of handicrafts, all of that disappeared from the United States. And that's whole communities lost their jobs as a result. And so it's understandable why people, saw that as a loss, because it was a deep loss. And, we didn't do enough or really, much of anything to try and address the harm to communities that resulted in providing adequate retraining, providing adequate trade adjustment assistance. I mean, we have a really small little trade adjustment assistance program that does a little bit, for communities that are hit, but it's just not nearly enough. And I also think that there wasn't enough attention to the fact that, some trade is distortive. It does have, for instance, if you trade with countries that have really lax environmental rules or really lax labor rules, they can naturally produce goods for much lower costs because they can do it in ways that don't face the same kind of regulatory conditions that we observe in the United States. And I do think the WTO was headed towards trying to deal with that problem. We could get into the complexities of it, but there was a move, I think, a beginning of a recognition that there needed to be some willingness to allow for differences in how goods were being produced and allow for states to charge for those differences. But I think what's happened is this kind of total rejection of the international trade system that Trump represents is kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's taking those grievances, which are real and valid, and those sense of loss, which is real and valid, and turning it into like a rejection of the system altogether, as opposed to trying to figure out how do we do a much better job of addressing the communities that have been hit hard by this, to provide some redistribution, retraining, et cetera. And also, how do we incorporate, do a better job of incorporating certain kinds of regulatory protections into our trading system, which, traditionally there've been a real resistance to. I think, yeah. So I think that's where I think we went wrong. But I don't think that like this idea that somehow we should like try to levy some like fee and then use that fee to like offset something. I just don't think that's how the system really works. I think we should create global surplus and then tax it, and use the taxes to provide assistance to the people who need it.